Welcome to another episode Beyond Perception, where we are going to explore empowering perspectives beyond our current knowing. I'm your host, Simon, and before introducing today's guest, I had to clarify the proper pronunciation of his name, which turned out really interesting. That's why I love to share that with you too. Please enjoy. But I have to ask, it's Darren Doherty. Do I pronounce that right, or?
Well, I'm thinking,
I'm not sure if I could pronounce that right.
no, that's okay. That's okay. That's my colonized name. But I've been thinking of decolonizing my name for a long time. And there's a bumper sticker that's in the city the town that I live in, because this place is called Castlemaine.
Yeah.
And Castlemaine it was named after a town in the west of Ireland, which is Castlemaine, and it's got a Gaelic name, so it's the English version of a Gaelic name, just like mine is. And the bumper sticker here, because a lot of people who speak English, or especially native English speakers, they say castle instead of castle, and they have different pronunciation, and you can sort of see which school they went to, when they say that. Or whether their parents owned their house or didn't.
Yeah, a part of my accent.
So there's a bumper sticker that says there's no R in Castlemaine, because people here, they say it's Castlemaine, not Castlemaine. And I'm thinking of doing the same with my name, because my Gaelic name is O'Doherty, and the English called it Doherty. And I'm thinking of having a bumper sticker saying that there's no dough in O'Doherty. Although I do like bread.
Okay, I will listen to our recording now. I will keep practicing over the next days, and when we meet again, I hopefully
I'll change my name by then.
Well, is it
very, very difficult for English speakers, but anyway, that's all right.
Yeah, well, it's a true pleasure to be here today with you. And for those which don't have a context about what you do, I might just share a few words about your background. You are, from what I know, a land manager, a developer, author, trainer, a pioneer, and one of the world's foremost experts in regenerative agriculture and living systems. And you're the originator of the Regrarians nonprofit educational training platform with a network of, I believe, more than 15,000 alumnis. So, yeah, very excited. A warm welcome, Darren.
Thank you. It's a lot of people to have hugged and shook the hand off.
Yeah, it's amazing. And
yeah, not quite as many as Amma, the hugging saint from India. He hugs for a profession.
Yeah, my wife went to hug her here in Switzerland.
Yeah, no, I got to the front. I worked for her, and I got to the front of the queue, which was very kind of her. And she gave me a bocce ball and an apple. So how about that?
Okay.
That's my name. So thank you, Simon. Thanks. A real pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to our conversation.
Yeah, and yeah, so the both of us connected through two of our partners in a project in Panama, where we actually are aiming at restoring a natural island paradise. So we're going to take part in your training. I believe begins end of this month.
So yep, exactly. Our 10th online farm planning program. Yeah, we're pretty excited about it. Being our 10th since 2017. So
yeah, so I'm looking forward to that. And to be very honest, so far my context about permaculture and land restoration is rather superficial. and I believe that is the same to many of our listeners.
Have you got any alfalfa sprouts or something like that yet?
my wife has a cactus.
Oh, that's great.
Cactus kind of plantation on our balcony, so that maybe counts for something. But
yeah. You'll wait for the fruit once every 8 years and then make some tequila or something.
Yeah, she's from Mexico. Yeah.
Oh, well, there you
So
go.
that's
There you go.
yeah, that's part of her home here in Switzerland. Uh, would you mind sharing a bit, or maybe briefly, so to our listeners who don't have that much of a context, possibly, what is I just used the term permaculture, and is that what you're doing? And if so, like,
Yeah.
could you describe what permaculture is about, and maybe then also add on what did you pioneer? What's your contribution? What do you do different?
Well, permaculture is a design science that was developed in Australia by David Holmgren and Bill Mollison in the 1970s. It was, you might say, a carryover from the revolt of the 1960s and 70s. Both of those gentlemen were, well, distant apart in age by about 30 years. But both had, I would say, kind of similar upbringings, in that they were quite didactic, which is, I suppose, for country folk or for people who live in peri-urban societies in Australia in the post-war period, in particular, people had yards, they had gardens, they had access to a wide range of different exposure sites for the environment, whereas people who live, well, not many people have that sort of opportunity now, so it's not really as likely that people would have that sort of inspiration these days, I suppose. But they came up with a design science that was released in the form of a book, Permaculture 1, in 1978. And that sort of built on some of the other stuff that was going on a bit earlier than that in the US, in particular, the Whole Earth Catalogue and those sorts of things, the integrated urban house, and a number of other sort of back to the land movements and self-sufficiency movements. But it sort of took it to another step, I suppose, in the sense that it had a design framework wrapped around it. And so for me, I suppose the exposure to permaculture came about third along the line or fourth along the line in terms of what I was exposed to that turned me on to land planning. I mean, I grew up on a farm outside of Bendigo, not far from where we live now, and that was a mixed farm. So it had animals, we grew crops, we had fruit trees, we had pigs, we had lots of water systems. And the systems of water and irrigation were built around the work of another precursor to permaculture, which is keyline. So that was the landscape that I grew up in, and it had forestry, and it was a classic mixed farm, which is, if you go back 100 years ago, is not that unusual to have a mixed farm where it's maybe a bit above subsistence. And then so the keyline thing was part of the exposure to permaculture as well. And so permaculture sort of took the keyline thing on as its broader acre framework for agricultural scale ecosystems. And then the other thing that I was exposed to pretty early was Fukuoka's work, Masanobu Fukuoka, who I think died in about 2008. He was a Japanese farmer, and a friend of mine had his book, or his first book, The One Straw Revolution, which he lent to me, and I think in about 1986. And that was pretty profound because it spoke to a kind of agriculture which I wasn't familiar with. No cultivation. It was subtropical, being in the southern part of Japan, and so on. So that was a really big exposure for me and influence. And then the other thing that was an exposure was whole farm planning. So whole farm planning as a as a methodology was had been around for a while in Australia. And so when I started off in the late 80s, early 90s, it was those 3 or 4 influences which sort of came together. So from the outset, I wasn't really defined by any one of those, and continued to sort of look at things as more as an integrationalist than as a devotee.
I could imagine one could become very ideological
well, that's right,
about things.
Yeah, and I'm not a dogmatic person from that perspective. So yeah, and then it's just continued on. So I've sort of, as it were, collected land management methodologies ever since, and my work, especially since I developed the Regrarians platform, which had a precursor in what I called the Regen 10 before I came up with the word Regrarians. But this whole platform approach, which is trying to get some order out of the complexity that people find themselves having to contend with when they're either, because there's usually one or two, when they're either embarking on a land management adventure, which they've never really done before, whether that's growing cactus on a balcony or or getting the finest crop of alfalfa sprouts. No, not really. Or getting that piece of land that they want to do the sort of back to land thing, or existing farm managers or land managers who are looking to make a change in the way they do things. And they're really the two camps that we work with. And so to best address their concerns, what we find ourselves doing is having to have a really wide scope of answers and options. And there's no one methodology that provides all of those. So we're sort of like this open book in a sense, collectors of methodologies, and trying to link the right solution to the issues that people find themselves having to grapple with.
So you're saying you have this whole continuum of kind of ideas or methods or concepts, but then from what I know, you also seem to have a process which you are taking people through or clients through step by step to look at different, I think you call it layers to the land, or?
Yeah. Well, planners work in layers, and I sort of probably by the mid to late 90s, I developed a process, what I call the works pattern, and that was really about client and client management, project design, and the diagnosis and design part of that, and then project management. So it was trying to develop a sort of an A to Z or A to Z sort of process with that. That's why I called it a work pattern, because it was a workflow, for want of a better word. But that was for me, right? And so, or for us in our work. But when others don't have the same context, they don't have the same start point, and they don't have the same trajectory. So ultimately, when we started teaching, we could see that we couldn't just take my work pattern or my workflow and give that to others, because they had a different context. Or context. They had a landscape context, and they had a personal and enterprise context, all of which was very different to my own. So, I was dealing with different clients, and I was dealing with different contexts as well. But context is very important, and you need to, I believe, arrive at that yourself so that you understand what directions you want to go in. So by about 2010, 2011, I started to re-look at the keyline scale of permanent, or keyline scale of relative permanence, which P.A. Yeomans developed as part of his keyline plan. And it had 8 factors, not layers, 8 factors. And they were climate, land shape, farm dams, farm roads, farm buildings, farm trees, farm buildings, subdivision fencing, and soils. And I looked at that I'd looked at it for a long time as a set of factors, but I'd never really considered it as a framework for layers. But around then I did. And and that was a real big turning point, because I looked at that more critically and changed the words. Like, it was a framework that I could adapt from and change. And I added on, I changed the words, some of the words, but there were more variations on the themes, on the factors. So climate stayed the same. Land shape went to geography, because it's a lot broader than land. Geography means a lot more than land shape. Went from farm dams to water, just being the water layer, because the water or the farm water is not just farm dams, it's also, or ponds, it's a whole lot of other stuff. I went from farm roads to access, and because that's, again, like geography, it's a much broader term. A road is a part of an access network. And initially I went from farm trees to forestry, and last year we changed forestry to ecosystems. I actually wanted to call it agroforestry, but I thought that was probably a bit too direct, but we think ecosystems is actually better, because it's an ecosystems layer. Right. So we're still, like I said, at the start, we're still adapting what we do, and you should always, look in the rear vision mirror, continually apply feedback to what you're doing. So that was that. And then we looked at the farm buildings and just called that the building layer, which some people will call the structures layer. And then, when our platform gets translated into Spanish, or it gets translated in, that layer is either edificios or structuras. So I find that interesting when we get translations done, because sometimes the Latin translations are perhaps a bit more correct than the English terms that we use. I couldn't call that layer the edifice layer, because no one would know what I'm talking about, or they think it's about monuments or something. And then the subdivision layer we call the fencing layer. That goes to cercas in Spanish. And then the soils layer. Then we felt that it wasn't holistic, so we added on, and originally I looked at it, calling it the marketing layer, because I thought that farmers or producers need to market, but I changed that to economy, and we've stuck with that, and I'm happy with that. And then the last layer is the energy layer. So when we look at all of those layers within those, and we've got probably about 350 or 400 then categories within those layers of consideration. Not all, if you were to look at it as a checklist, not all of those 300 or 400 elements of consideration you will need to look at, because it's not relevant. Some of those are not relevant to you, but that just shows the sort of complexity of what we're dealing with on an agricultural landscape with humans and their enterprises. There's a lot of considerations. I've not thought of it before, but there's probably 100 or so still that you need to consider. So that's a lot of complexity to deal with, and having a framework, or as we've developed, helps to navigate that. And so when it comes to our training, and this is the other thing that we've changed, we've gone from being moved away from that sort of familiar model that's been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, where you hire somebody as a consultant to do work for you. I mean, Leonardo da Vinci was hired to do canal design, right? As well as do the occasional portrait. So, so it's not a new game, and the game is you get given a brief. And so he got given a brief to design a canal that was going to go from A to B. Please design it, Leonardo. That's your job, mate. So he would go through a workflow process to realize that. And but it was his design, right? And then people like even Cato, going back 2,000 years ago, which I've been very influenced by his book called De Agricultura. Well, when he wrote that book, he was kind of doing like we're doing now. He was saying, look, it's your farm. You should know what you're doing. Yeah. So, I think I tied that off. So we'll go on to the next thing.
Yeah. And so like from what I understand, you're permanently reiterating best processes to kind of seem to achieve something. What would you say is your vision, which orientates you, so that you're not getting stuck in a fixed concept or ideology? What are you trying to achieve? What is this all about? Is it what you also mentioned?
Well, you have it. I mean, I have my own context, or we have our own context of achievement, and you might say that that's just to sustain this planet somehow, or sustain to start with. I mean, I could say, yeah, we want to regenerate the planet, which is a great thing to do, but we better sustain it first, because regeneration is a fair way off. But coming back to individuals that we deal with, people come to us because they have a particular idea of what we can help them with. And I think that's probably a common goal. But their goals will be at the same time quite different. So some people might, well, I'll go back. What people will say to us in common when we establish, because we always start by establishing people's holistic context. So, and we've done that with thousands of people now. So we've got, a fair sampling of people's objectives, and most people want more or less the same things. They want to improve biodiversity, and this is not in any order, but they very much want to improve biodiversity. That's important to them. They want to improve their family lives, if they're lucky enough to have one. They want to improve their financial security, and they want to improve their productivity, or the productivity of their enterprise. Now, given that they're mostly agricultural enterprises, and that relates to whatever form of enterprise that they're undertaking. So, and I would also say that they want to reduce inputs. But that's part of a greater resiliency and profitability, productivity brief. So, people will say those first things. I'll say, I want to improve biodiversity. I want to improve my family life. I want to have more financial stability. And so I want to be more productive. Well, their statements, what do they actually mean, and how do you get there? That's where we start to delve in a bit deeper. So what biodiversity means for one person. So on the project that you're working on in Panama, biodiversity there is going to look very different to Benjamin in Somaliland, or someone in Western Australia, or someone in Mexico. It's very, very much site specific. And so that's where just having one approach is not going to help. And the other thing that that I suppose we realise, and this goes back to the point on Cato, is that you're the one who's managing that landscape. So you should understand how to do that. You're the best person. So it's kind of like, I kind of look at it like people when they get business plans done. The best person, well, some companies go and hire KPMG or Ernst Young or someone like that to go and do their business plans for them, and I get that at that level, but most people are not big corporations, right? So if you're just a few people in an enterprise, a family, or a small group of people, then you're the best people to do the business plan, not hire someone else. And it's the same with a farm plan. You may not have had any experience in doing a business plan, but actually doing a business plan is a really educative process. And often people will do it with some mentorship or mentors. They might get some, they might pick off the shelf someone who helps them with some of the financials, some of the accounting. They might have someone who they work with to do some of the market strategies and those sorts of things. And really, it's no different to a farm plan. A farm plan, in a sense, is a sort of a farm enterprise plan, and it's as well. So it's got the business plan component, the enterprise component, but it's also got a land management component. So it's a landscape plan as well. So again, the best way to do that is to not pay someone like me to do that. It's to be involved in a process where you do that yourself. And that's where we've really landed. And I don't see us really changing from that position because it just seems so damn obvious. Certainly in the past, in the first 10 years of my career, which will be 30 years next year, I certainly did that. I made plans for people, and and they went and did them or not. But they weren't their plans; they were my plans. And so we just don't think that that's the best way to go. And the evidence seems from the feedback that we've got and the number of people that we work with that's correct. That's a good decision.
And it makes intuitively totally sense. And you mentioned patterns before. Is it really about to understand or discover the pattern of the land? And you mentioned the pattern of maybe me as the one like managing or developing that, or like doing the design, understanding my own patterns, and then the pattern of that enterprise, which is so that to become clear about the patterns and then to align to those patterns. Or
yeah, definitely. A late friend of mine, Dan Palmer, wrote 2 articles comparing our work to that of the late Christopher Alexander. And Christopher Alexander who was a very famous architect and author, who he wrote a book called A Pattern Language, and which is a great title because so much of what we do in the design sciences is about, like you said, looking at various patterns and then trying to make changes to them, but then also use patterns to make those changes. And some of those patterns, what Dan was, I suppose, trying to compare was our platform and how it takes you along a somewhat linear pathway to something like Alexander's, which was, I would say, a bit more organic in its pattern to what ours was. But he was more applying it to architecture, whereas we're applying it to ours is much, much more multidisciplinary. Well, it would have been interesting to speak to Mr. Alexander about that and how his work kind of been, or how his way of working might have melded in with ours. But when you're dealing with we're trying not to make things too academic for people as well. A lot of people come to us and the biggest problem that they have is how overwhelmed they are with just life and living, time constraints, all of the rest of it. So, it's a luxury to be academic, so we're trying not to be that. And that's why some people will say, look, can I just pay you, because it's easier for me to pay you and you do it and it'll be okay. And I'm going, yeah, you say that, but no, because you'll just, well, you probably won't do it. You probably won't do what you are seeking to do, or if you do it, then you'll spend money badly. Even and I won't be able to predict every outcome. So if I relate that to the project that you're involved with in Panama, for example, I mean, I could quite safely spend tens of thousands of that collective project's money, even more, in design, in doing this beautiful landscape plan and lots of visits and lots of design charrettes, and we'd all feel really good about it, and it'd be really pretty, and it'd be a great master plan and a great document. But then it's actually going to be too front-ended, and which is the way I've sort of got to it. And this is one of the problem, I think, with a lot of design, is especially landscape or agroecological design, is that which is not usual. There's not many agroecological designers out there, and there's a reason for that, because it's very complex. And there's a lot of things, especially when you get into integrated systems. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. Like if you just design, like just think of it this way: if you design a road, okay, just one thing, you just design a road. There's lots of things that can go badly with a road, right? Engineers design roads all the time, and they still have problems when they design roads, right? But if you try and design that road and then connect it with buildings and connect that with electricity and plumbing, and then put that into an agricultural landscape and have that interaction and trees and on it goes, that's a lot of complexity to sort of forecast the negatives of. So what you're doing, and a lot of the time when you're doing a design, and this is what a lot of what a lot of first-time designers don't realize, is that they're overly optimistic with the results. Like they think everything that they do will work. They don't understand perhaps the things that can go wrong, and that's a big part of our advocacy and our training, is to say, right, just pull back a bit and cool your heels a bit, and let's just try and walk through this process. One step forward, sometimes two steps back, and just keep going forward, but just don't go 20 steps forward and then 100 steps back, because that's what can happen. You can get collapse. And we've been involved with a lot of projects where there's been, or what we've seen, people just go motoring ahead. They've got all this money, or they've got whatever going on, all of this energy, and just make a lot of mistakes because they're not working at a reasonable pace, at a pace which meets their capable. This is pattern recognition again. Everyone has there's what I would call patterns of capability. Everyone and every landscape, every climate, all of the rest of it has different capabilities. So you don't want to go too far ahead of that. Otherwise, you'll test. Just because there is a capability doesn't. It's like when you're driving a car. A car has a capability of maybe going 200 kilometers an hour. That doesn't mean you sit on 200 kilometers an hour, right? You may not be capable of sitting on 200 kilometers an hour. The road isn't, etc. You know what I mean? So it's there's the capability of one thing that may not meet with the capability of other things that you're working with. And that's where complexity starts to come along. And so trying to get that in order is very important to us, because we can't stand the idea of people wasting their time, wasting their money, wasting their energy, and failing. because for a lot of people, this may be their one go at their dream, particularly those who are moving to the land. You know, they might have sold it, they might have got their inheritance, or they might have got sold their property in the city or something like that. And, you know, they've put everything that they've got into this dream only for them to then have this complete failure or very, very hard times.
So there seems to be a big part of that to understand your own ego. Like,
oh, definitely, yeah. Well,
like
I think it was my friend Brock Dolman. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, a friend of mine, Brock Dolman, said you've got to move from the ego system into the ecosystem for that very much, and it is. It's a. I mean, a lot of people talk in modern speak about ecosystems, and you know, there's the political ecosystem, and there's this, but there is an ecosystem, and there's climates of those ecosystems, and that's why our climate layer tries to consider that. You know, there's the climate of regulation. There's your own climate in terms of what you are capable of and those around you are capable of at any given time, because that can change or be different. And then there's the meteorological climate and so on. So you've got to understand all of that before you, which is why it's at the top of our series of considerations, because we think that's really important for you to realize from the get-go.
And you said before, kind of what you're hoping for is to sustain the earth, which I
sure,
yeah, obviously I'm all in. However, there are different theses and proposals out there, and one of them is well, and I have heard that a few months ago. I think I believe it was the CEO of Syngenta, one of the largest producers of fertilizers, and he said something along the lines of, "We can't afford the luxury of organic farming. We have to produce enough crops to feed the world." And what's your experience like with all those projects in terms of food output from regenerative agricultural comparing to conventional farming? Is that comparable?
Well, there's never really been. I mean, that approach. That's a trope that goes back. Well, I'd take it right back to the founder of that idea, which is Norman Borlaug, who was the father of the Green Revolution. And I mean, I'm reading. I was just flew through an airport yesterday, and I got a copy of Bill Gates' latest book, which is where, you know, he's looking at how we solve the climate crisis, and he's got 2 chapters devoted to how we grow things. So he's got, you know, so he's categorized that book on how we grow things, how we power ourselves, how we get ourselves around, and so on, which is perfectly reasonable as a set of considerations. But one of the things that he celebrates as well is the Haber-Bosch process, and which Syngenta use and still gets used today, to use predominantly liquid natural gas to create nitrogen, which is then used for crop growing. And you know, it seems fairly clear to me from the people that I've worked with that there's more than enough evidence that people who are there are plenty of people out there who are great producers who don't use or very little outside input from that perspective. Fertilizer input, the biggest fertilizer input that or the biggest input in agriculture is fossil fuels. That's the one that you know, so Mr. Syngenta can talk all day, all night about you know, the values of nitrogen, but where did the nitrogen come from, and what's the footprint of that nitrogen? And what about the fact that, 80+% of what he's putting in on actually goes into the air because it's volatile, or it runs off and pollutes waterways? So, a lot of people who live in that sort of space don't deal with externalities, and they should, because a lot of them have studied economics, and externalities is a economics term, right? But they've not bothered to worry about that. They just just say, all right, well, if you buy this and put this on, this equals this much product, and this can support perhaps 2.5 times what the world should be supporting in population. So that's a good outcome. Well, I'd probably argue that's not such a great outcome, because that's us not being sustainable. If you've got a system of nitrogen production which is completely founded on fossil fuel use, well then, the fossil fuels are not renewable, so they're going to run out, and B, they put into the atmosphere an unsustainable amount of, and into the environment an unsustainable amount of pollution. So, I mean, the definition of pollution is a resource which has or it becomes entropic. It gets wasted. It's terrible. All of that nitrogen that's produced should be used very carefully, and should be used to the maximum benefit. It shouldn't be just used to grow crops badly. When I know farmers who one might class as more regenerative, who use artificially produced nitrogen, and they use it very strategically and with great results, but they're very rare. So, and then I know lots of producers who engage with the 78% of the air that you and I are still breathing right now, which is nitrogen, right? And the nitrogen cycle is there. And there's lots of organisms who live in the soil and live on the soil, which are part of that nitrogen cycle. And a lot of producers have engaged with that cycle and do extremely well. So it's a sales pitch. That's all it sounds.
It's obvious.
It's like it's. And look, because there's not a lot of, which is surprising, not surprising. I mean, when I read something like what Bill Gates has written, I haven't read the whole book yet. I've read about a quarter of it, and there's some good stuff in there, And this is my approach. A lot of people will say a lot of bad things about someone like Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or this Syngenta guy, or these global celebrity figures, these powerful men generally, and sometimes they've actually got something reasonable to say. I mean, they don't get to be where they are without having half an idea, right? So there's always a kernel of good or something to take from what they say, but that's not to say often those people are working in echo chambers, and they just don't have the exposure to the other options that are out there, or they've got people in their ear going, no, that's no, they work in a lot of, I've worked with a lot of the people like this in terms of high net worths, and they have a cadre of yes people around them who generally feed them information that keeps their own narrative alive. That's an interesting one. They're just like everyone else, really.
Yeah, and back to the ecosystem. Yeah.
Well, that's right. I mean, humans, and we'll all be guilty of this. I mean, if you were to take on every bit of new information that's out there, and there's a lot of it, and you were to adopt it straight away, then that means that you're probably living too close to innovation, and innovation is a dangerous place to be, because there's a high failure rate. I'll give you an example. I looked at Ernst Gotch's syntropic system. I'd been exposed to it for years, mainly through its work, through the work that he'd done and some of his followers had done in the subtropics and tropics. And I thought, yeah, look, it's a good system. It makes sense and so on. It's successful in where it is, but I didn't really consider it to be a broad scale technique or approach that one could use in, let's say, agricultural economies where the cost of wages were high, because it seemed to me to be quite a high labour input system, which it is. But then I've since met people who are the second and third generation students or users of that system who have adapted it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they've adapted it in ways, and they've used this tool and they've used that. And so they've started to take the basis of syntropic agroforestry or agriculture and then use other methodologies to improve it for their own circumstance, to adapt it. And that to me is a really good example of how you can take, something that I won't say syntropic agriculture is dogmatic, but take a particular theme of approach and then adapt it so it has a greater adaptability, right? So, I think that's a good example of like in my own case being a bit skeptical, not skeptical of the method, but just being a bit slow on the approach, as opposed to getting excited about it, going, oh wow, this is the next best thing, right? I'm jumping onto it. I'm a bit more cautious than that, and I think in large part most people are, because it's too dangerous in a way to be otherwise.
I guess that's I mean, that would be my guess without that broader expertise, is that many of those farmers out there, maybe they hear permaculture or one of those things, and they have this picture of idealists who live in the woods and from love, and they're thinking, wait, I have to sustain myself. I need to make money. No, I can just. I would love the idea possibly, but I have to maintain myself, and so like I get that to really create change on a global scale, there needs to be a connection between profits and regenerative agricultural development. Is that like?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. No, well, I mean, the world lives on currency. I mean, it's simple as that. I mean, you can't. Well, it's interesting. I mean, some people have the circumstances where, let's say, they can live in the world, right? But that's not many people. You've got to have a whole lot of. You've got to own your land, and land is, owning land takes either inheritance or money, or colonization, right? So there's a variety of pathways that you arrive at owning land, and that's not something that everyone can do. And then it's got to be the right amount of it, and you've got to not have debt and all of those sorts of things. So, and you've got to have the knowledge to be able to do it. And doing that from zero, let's say you get a piece of land which has got no infrastructure, and you want to build that dream, well, that's going to take a lot of capital. However you do it, even if you do a tiny house and do it all small scale, it's still going to take expertise and resources and experience, and more broadly, a community around you to support you, because you can't do it yourself. And you can't even do it as a family. You've got to have, you've got to be involved with a community of people.
And then we're back to the eco, respectively, the ecosystem. Yeah? So you have to kind of get off your own head. Yeah.
Well, it's that concept of trying to be independent rather than interdependent. And to be independent means that, independence is I would say, is a fairly modern concept and a modern construct, because you can only be you can, if you want right now, if you've got enough money, live in your house and be independent. You can not speak to anyone. You can wear headphones all day and and have Uber bring you food, and you will be able to sustain some sort of bizarre lifestyle, but you can be independent, you know, not have a partner, not have a dog. You can live alone like that, right? Right. That's a sort of a acute version of that. You can try and do that with your family on your piece of land, and, you know, be ruggedly independent. We're going to do this ourselves, and da 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 da. And it's like, okay, well, you're a social organism. The community of 4 or 5 of you will only sustain you so much. So, you know, so it gets to the point is I can look at these acute examples, and people need to consider interdependence as much more, and that goes to our education as well. I mean, that's why we have developed the course structure that we have, because it's an interdependent course. In other words, it's participatory. It has to be. If it isn't, then well, again, you're living in some sort of bubble vacuum. I mean, think of how we get taught at school, and that's why a lot of people resist doing courses. We get taught to be independent, right? We get our own seat. We get taught. We got, you know, you get your own test. You can't be involved. I mean, who does that? Go to any initiation that humans have done over thousands of years. It's never been, oh, don't share your results, or don't look over my shoulder. I mean, how ridiculous. Yeah.
It's being force-fed with some information, but it's not really learning to think for oneself.
Yeah.
It's
not collaborative.
Darren, thank you so much for taking the time for us and sharing from your experience and what you're up to. And of course, I will link your page so that everybody who's interested can learn more about you. Is there anything else you want to share with us? The last word? Or?
Oh, no, I'm pretty good.
Well, Darren, thank you so much. Yeah, then I wish you all the best. I look forward to doing the training and learning
in a couple of weeks on the Rex, and seeing what's going on down in Panama. It's very different to Switzerland, I'm sure.
Oh, it is. Yeah, it's completely different. Yeah, it's very humid here. It's not humid at all. Yeah.
No.
Yeah, different culture, different patterns, a lot of different patterns. Yeah, so I look forward to exploring them together. Thank you so much for your time.
No worries, mate. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everybody for listening and watching. Some pretty amazing perspectives. Thank you for being with us, and see you soon again. All the best.
Thank you.
What's my potential? What's really inside me? Is it possible to be joyful and to express who I truly am? Do I have unique gifts and talents? And if I do, how do I find them? And if I find them, how do I bring them into life? And is it even possible to make a living from what I actually love to do? Those were some of the questions which drove me now more than a decade. And I don't want to give you a definitive answer, but I learned very valuable principles on my quest that helped me to discover who I am and to bring what I am actually into this life, beyond expectations, beyond conditioning, beyond limiting or self-defeating negative thoughts. And now I want to be the bridge and pass those principles on to you, and not only remind you with my words, but actually enable you to discover and experience that for yourself, real self-discovery, that you are a wonderfully creative being, a genius in the truest sense of the word, and you have the potential and the possibility to unfold what is actually in you and set yourself creatively free. This is my mission. Very important, please don't believe my words or possibly your own skeptical thoughts, but check it out, experience it for yourself, and take part in our next seminar, Structural Creativity. More information here. I'm really looking forward to set your creativity free.